This week, Chrisoulis, creator of comics about the formation of the band The Smiths and the lives of David Bowie and Jack Kirby, talks about all those works with our own Emmet. But first, help keep this podcast coming out weekly. Support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. With your pledge of at least $4 a month, you can access hours of bonus podcasts, including an issue-by-issue discussion of The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko. Pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics.
This is Emmet.
This is Con.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Emmet in country Victoria, and I'm on the line at the moment with Con Chrisoulis. How are you, Con?
I'm doing great. How's it going, Emmet?
You are right now on the opposite side of the world from me. You are in the UK at the moment, so God bless you for being up at this time for this call. For those listening, Con is a comic creator, he's a lecturer, he's a multidisciplinary artist, he's a musician. You're putting us all to shame, Con. And I first came upon Con's work when I researched a short article I wrote about the influence of David Bowie on comic books. And I happened to read Con's book, Rebel Rebel, which takes the early life of Bowie as its subject matter and exists as a webcomic, and you can buy through Comixology. And Con then reached out and said hello, and now we're talking. So thank you for doing that, Con, because most folks just go, oh, that's nice, and move on with their life. But you actually took the initiative, and you're like, hi, who are you?
I usually reach out to journalists to kind of fix some kind of mistakes that they wrote about my bio or something about the biographies themselves. But in this case, I was like, thanks. Everything was great. Thanks for mentioning me.
Yeah, well, there was a sort of recent glut of David Bowie material, and obviously since his passing, and again, even the other day, I saw it online. There was all these people talking about when David Bowie died, everything went wrong. It's like some sort of event. So now folks are reflecting on Bowie and what Bowie meant to them, and I'd read that Mike Allred Bowie book, which is this beautiful object, but it is sort of overly dependent on this surreal approach to Bowie and this sort of dreamweaver idea of Bowie. And why I was so taken with Rebel Rebel and what you did was because you actually focused on David Jones and his childhood, and his family and his upbringing, and the material which I think has been alluded to in many years, sort of here and there, about his brother, about the mental illness issue, about the confusing parentage. But you actually just laid it all out and found interesting material in there. Didn't just pass it off as, oh, this is colorful detail. This is, no, let's talk about this stuff. I was curious about that, and I've since found out that this is an approach you've taken to a couple of other of your subjects. But why did you choose to focus on Bowie in this particular way?
Well, I wouldn't be able to approach it if I wasn't interested in Bowie as an artist himself. So, I mean, I have been a fan for years and years, and I actually had a glam rock concept art band a while ago that was heavily influenced by him. So I was, I am a fan. It's not like I caught onto the bandwagon after Bowie died. So actually what happened was to kind of narrate the series of events that led to Bowie's biography. What happened was I'd been working in comics so I grew up in Australia anyway. I was doing some comics there, and then I moved to Athens, Greece, where I kind of made a name for myself doing comics there. And then due to the financial crash, I moved to the UK. And at the same time when that was happening, because I was kind of trying to find a better future for myself, trying to kind of cut a better path for me, because comics weren't making anything for me at the time. All the publishers were folding in Greece. I started studying. I started film studies This kind of led me to another path where I wanted to move on to a larger format of telling longer stories. And because at the time I was doing comics in Greece, but I mean the longest form of comic I'd done was about 50 pages. It was no longer than that.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, I was looking into my family's history, but I can get into that later on. And I did a first graphic novel on that. And I was really, really infatuated by the Smiths, the band Smiths, and Bowie. And I had to kind of make, these were the kind of the two things I really wanted to get into. Because what happened was I was reading biography after biography for years and years about these two. There's a band, the Smiths and Bowie the artist. And I was really, but I won't say pissed off, you know, it's a strong sentiment, but I was really annoyed by the fact that, you know, they skim off the origin stories of these real human beings, these people that lived and the stories that kind of really meant a lot to me in terms of what influenced their later work. And they'd skim them off, or they'd focus like a chapter in these massive books on their early lives. Yeah. And they just go into their careers. And to me, this was the kind of the stuff that really influenced their early output, especially for band Smiths and David Bowie's early output. You know, you can see in David Bowie's case, in The Man Who Sold the World, or even in on the Stardust album, songs that allude to his brother and his family life. Yeah. So then I started researching heavily. I decided to do the Smiths in any case at that point. But David Bowie was at a really low. I don't know. No one remembers this. Everyone's like, I really loved Bowie for years. They kind of forget this period where in the 90s it was kind of well, in the 80s it was especially embarrassing, but in the 90s he was trying to catch on to this kind of, you know, the 9-inch nails bandwagon, and his look looked a bit weird, you know, compared to what was going on in grunge and Britpop. And so, you know, he was on a bit of a low in terms of popularity, so I decided to do the Smiths before anyone caught on to it, because there was already people doing some Bowie stuff here and there, and he was, you know, in the comic circuit, he was always popular. Anyway, I did the Smiths thing. That was I researched that book heavily, and it was just I was researching the origins of the band for 3 years and publishing a webcomic every day for 3 years. And that eventually was published by Omnibus Press. So the webcomics themselves, this is what happened just when I moved to the UK during the financial crisis that was going on in Greece. A chocolate company in Greece reached out to me. Okay. So Greece's biggest chocolate company, kind of like Cadbury, called Eon. Yep. And they said, hey, we're gathering the biggest comics artists in Greece, kind of 5 or 6 biggest comics artists in Greece, and we're commissioning anything, a comic that and you could do a weekly comic or a daily comic, and you could do anything you want. The subject matter didn't matter to them, as long as on the top of the banner it said, I'm hosted by, you know, Eon Chocolates. Yep. And I said, okay, this is probably going to pay, because I just enrolled on graphic design studies at Brighton University. It's going to pay my studies now, because I was in a real financial mess at the time. And so I opted for a daily comic. And I said, I've got this Smiths thing going on. And I did that for 3 years with them. They were paying me every day. And it was really popular in the Smiths circle. So when that ended, I told the whole origin story of the Smiths until the band formed. So when the band formed, the story ends after 450 pages. They said, okay, what do you want to follow this up with? And I said, David Bowie. So we shake hands and stuff. I was in Greece that Christmas 2015. We shake hands and stuff. I was about to begin the story in kind of, I think, February or March. Like 2 weeks later, Bowie died. He passed away, yeah. Out of the blue. Yeah. And I'm like, oh God, this is not happening. Everyone's going to jump onto this thing now. Yeah. And there's going to be like a host of graphic novels and stuff. I was really, really, I was pissed off at Bowie for dying more than kind of, sad about it. But yeah, and that happened, and the band, there was a massive bandwagon. Anything from cushions to pins to t-shirts to graphic novels. popped out.
There was this sort of rediscovery of Bowie, obviously, after he passed away. People want to reassess, they want to relive their memory of him. And I read through, you're familiar with Mark Fisher? Yeah, so I read through his K-Punk collection of essays, and he has a...
Oh, no, I was thinking another Fisher, sorry. I was thinking Seth Fisher.
Oh, no, not the artist. No. The sort of cyber left academic from, I think it was at Warwick University, and he used to have a blog called K-Punk, and he's written things like, he wrote Capitalist Realism and stuff like that, and he had written this review of Bowie's album The Next Day, I think for Wired. It's one of the most savage reviews I've ever read. He just attacks Bowie. And the thing he attacks him for, so the next day, so before Black Star, he attacks him for this sort of moribund nostalgia. Like this restaging. And, you know, his main evidence for this is the album cover, where you have the text box for The Next Day overlaid on top of the photo for Heroes. And he's like saying this is a visual representation of this entire project as an album. It's digging up 70s Bowie, 80s Bowie, early 80s Bowie, and just reserving it again for 30 something, 40 something music fans. And Black Star comes out, and all of a sudden people are back on board. Like, Bowie's a genius. He's amazing. He was a magician. He did all these things.
Yeah.
He was the prophet of the internet, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So your timing was interesting in terms of you getting it just at this moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting that you said that about The Next Day, because the graphic designer of the cover, that's the cover you just mentioned, Jonathan Barbrook, was visiting the University of Brighton in 2013 or 14, I can't remember which year, and he gave us a really long presentation about the reasoning behind the design of the cover. So this is way before Bowie died. And everyone was, the whole class, or it was the whole cohort actually, like 3 classes, all 3 years, kind of like 120 students or something. And everyone was interested in Barnbrook. No one was interested in Bowie as a subject.
Right. Yeah.
And you know that specific age group, which is kind of like early 20s, I suppose. I was there as a mature student. They're really not interested in Bowie at the time. And I remember, you know, where they now came out and stuff like that. Where are we now? And it just flew over people's heads. You know, young people and people into music in general were kind of into other stuff. And he wasn't making public appearances also at the time, which kind of, and it stopped touring too. And
all right, in the mid 2000s, I was working concert security, believe it or not, and it was in Ireland, and it was the week that it was the Oxygen Music Festival, I remember, and it was the week that Bowie had his heart attack, and he was scheduled to appear, and I'm there at the ticket line, and this Italian gentleman comes up to me, and he doesn't have a ticket, and he starts sobbing and crying, and I have to let him in, because he's traveled all the way from Italy to see Bowie. You know, he's come all this way. He has to see him. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that he wasn't playing that night. It was going to be The Darkness, The Darkness instead of Bowie. And I just waved him in. And I almost feel like that was cruel on my part. I should have actually said, you turn around, go back. He's not here.
Was it The Darkness, the band?
Yeah.
Or Darkness as in the dark stage? Oh no, my God. I don't know what's worse.
Yeah. I love that. Every now and then it hits me. I was like, do you remember The Darkness? God, they happened.
Yeah. Speaking of kind of camp 80s and stuff, I think that it's kind of the camp 80s really bad persona of Bowie that kind of held me off anything Bowie for years and years.
So you mean like Tin Machine?
Yeah, and prior to that, I mean, the Let's Dance stuff, which was mega in Australia, I suppose, because the video was in Australia and stuff.
Yeah, it's filmed in Sydney.
It's different. The outback, it doesn't look like a town. It looks like something in the bush or something.
I think there's this. I think you see the Coca-Cola sign from King's Cross in one shot. I think.
Oh right.
Yeah, because the kids are on the road and they're washing the car windows, and
right.
You can see the Coke sign. The reason I've jumped on this is because I've written a comic script set in Sydney during the 80s. And
right.
I've introduced a little Bowie tribute in one of the pages as a sort of nod to that music.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I know that sequence.
All right. So yeah, I mean, people or young people, like I was in my teenage years, I suppose, or early teenage years. We were into all other stuff except Bowie. He seemed like something from another age altogether. Like a relic from the 70s, and trying to make a comeback. And we were into metal and whatever it was at the time. A lot of Iron Maiden, Metallica, and stuff like that. And you were listening to a lot of pop at the same time, but Bowie just seemed like another thing. And then I interestingly got interested in him years later, because I mean, there were people who were mentioning Bowie all the time in interviews. So I started getting into grunge, and then you had the Man Who Sold the World come from Nirvana, which did wonders to Bowie's career, that single cover. And, because he suddenly reached out to another audience, everyone started looking into, just because Cobain mentioned him, everyone started looking into discography, because it was sold for like, in the dollar bins in record stores in the early 90s. And then, interestingly, Velvet Goldmine came out, which is a biography of sorts.
Yes.
And
a biography
that's the thing that really got me into.
It's a biography where all the historical characters of these artists are aliens. Like, they're actual aliens, is the thesis of this movie.
Right, yeah. Yeah. And Bowie hated it. Famously hated the movie, and he wouldn't give the rights to the movie at all. The music, his rights to the song to be played and stuff. And I just love that film. And to me, if anyone ever asked me in the visual medium which Bowie biography is the best one, I'd say Velvet Goldmine, hands down. I saw it at a very impressionable age, I think, but also because everything was like still kind of grungy and not glamorous at all. And then that came out, and it's like, it's like a breath of fresh air, just like Bowie was a breath of fresh air in '72.
Yeah.
Compared to what was going on in the hippie scene. It just looked great, and it kind of also gave me a weird insight into what happened to him in the 80s. He was abducted and turned into like he was just jumping on a bandwagon to survive, I suppose. But yeah,
yeah, and I guess as I was saying before, like your idea of drawing out the person of Bowie, just as you did with the Smiths. And also, as you've done with Jack Kirby in your book King. It's King. Yeah, like I love that. I love that approach. I love this idea of trying to establish the grounding of these people, because we know their stories already. And what you've done is you've almost presented a sort of entirely an ancestral view of these people. And that's not the word I was looking for. I was struggling there. Hermeneutics of fame. Let's go with that. Like you're setting up who these popular conceptions of these people will be through focusing on their pasts. And in the case of Jack Kirby, impressively, you're talking centuries of. You're talking about the entire Jewish experience in Europe and how that informed Kirby's conception of his own identity. And I think you can see in how he frames war in his comics work, which I think is brilliant as an insight. Well done there.
Thanks.
Because yes, I see people who are clearly devoted fans of Jack Kirby, And when they play with his toys, they're playing with his story ideas as superhero fiction ideas. And essentially, they've removed whatever historical context he was bringing to these creations, or whatever sense of being an American Jew who's witnessed fascism firsthand. And instead they're going, oh, this is Darkseid. He's really evil. Superman's going to punch him in the face a few times. Completely removed from the idea of what Darkseid represents.
It's funny that you'd say that, because what happened was I started creating the Jack Kirby biography for his to be released on the 100th anniversary of his birth. So to be released in 2017, August 2017. Not knowing that, or kind of feeling that someone else is going to do it again. And Tom Scioli did that, released his at the same day, on the same day as a webcomic as I did. So, I mean, people are going to do it.
Once again, as with the Mike Allred Bowie book, the Tom Scioli Kirby book has this fantastical approach to a real person. And while you are describing the experience of Kirby's family, at least it's lived experience. It's not like a cute little manga character winking at the reader. Like, it's actually, this happened.
At the time, I was a part of, I still am part of a lot of Kirby groups on Facebook. There's something like 5 or 6 really big ones that have something like between 2,000 to 10,000 members in them. And I'd share these webcomics every time I'd release one. So I'd release one every 2 weeks or something from August 2017 onwards. And because I was doing my Bowie comic at the same time, it was really hard to keep that on the Kirby one on schedule. But I was doing that. And just like with a lot of other posts on these Kirby groups, you'd get messages like, why is this turning into something political? I'm here to read Kirby comics. I don't want to read anything political. And, and anytime a conversation, someone starts a conversation about, you've got something like, again, Darkseid or something, and someone will comment like about Trump, or you'd get 100 comments about Trump underneath. And then you'd get the odd one out going, why is this turning into a political page? And so, there's a lot of fans, hardcore fans, that Kirby's political messages just fly over their heads. They just, they see the world in black and white, in a very Ayn Rand kind of way. And it's inevitable. And in any case, to go back to the reasoning again, I mean, I suppose a lot of it has to do with my own kind of origins too. Because I mentioned that the first really long form graphic novel that I really did was Dryland. Even though I was really popular in Greece at the time, I was doing a lot of political comics. But I really wanted to delve into something deeper than bashing, the far right in Greece. And that was getting a lot of pointers. It was voted twice comic book artist of the year or something, or comic book of the year or something in Greece. But that was, it wasn't making me kind of, I wasn't in the fulfilling my career in a way that I felt it would, and or I wanted to. And so once I got into researching my family's history in interwar Greece, that that experience of looking into my origins and kind of looking into and discovering a lot of discovering the reasoning for a lot of the behaviors from kind of my granddad's or my dad's side of the family. It got me interested in doing the same thing for people I never knew, like the Smiths or Bowie. And so in a sense, it was, and I delved into this because I started working on my PhD on this at the moment, on the reasoning behind, on the methodology behind all these graphic biographies. And it is a kind of Stanislavski kind of method acting type of situation where I kind of meditate a lot on well, not in a yogish way. I kind of ruminate a lot on the decisions that they made at an early age, because we don't have a lot of written artifacts on this. We've just got a lot of quotes.
Yeah.
And then I meditate a lot on the situation and the age and the time and time that this was happening. And I have to really think deeply about motivation and the dialogues that are going to occur. And that's why a lot of the times when you read a lot of biographies, a lot of the times the words that splurt out of non-fiction characters, of people that actually live, feel very weird. It's like, no, he'd never say that. I'm like, So I think people just, and a lot of the times you get a lot of quotes from songs coming out of people's mouths when they're like 5 or something. Yeah. That's another thing that's kind of a classic in biography. Yeah, I think it has, you have to kind of really think about motivation and the motivation of the secondary characters at the same time. I think I jumped into another topic altogether, which is
no, it's scanning. It scans. I think your approach, as you say, is to provide very well researched, very well cited material for the description in the comic. And I did notice when I was reading your Kirby comic and when I was reading the Bowie material as well, where you are clearly citing something that they have said. And the comic is saying, I did this and I did that. And I was getting momentarily confused because going, Con did this? No, Con didn't do this. Jack Kirby did this. And so you are presenting his sense of self in that moment. And that's a really interesting approach. And it sort of does lend itself to this idea of here is a real person, not Jack Kirby or David Bowie or Morrissey for that matter. So you're saying Dryland, because you were investigating your own family history, sort of set up that model because you're reconnecting to a sense of your family's past that you didn't have access to.
Yeah. Well, this is what happened. It was a massive realization in writing biographies or fiction or dramatized biographies, at least, in which the person actually lived it is not narrating the story because they died many years before that. And the same is for the case of Bowie, and the same applies to Morrissey, because I didn't interview Morrissey or Ma themselves. But in those cases, I was relying on their quotes, and I'll get into that in a bit, because it's the quotes that are setting up all the stories and are leading to this Stanislavski type method. But in Dryland's case, my ancestors all died, and some of them had died kind of violent deaths in the interwar in Greece. And but I'd been hearing these stories for years and years about what actually occurred there from my dad and from my granddad before he died, because he was part of these stories. But then he died, and I was like, oh man, I've actually got, I haven't got any first person accounts of what actually occurred there. It's all secondhand, from my dad and stuff and my uncles. So what happened was I started, and this is kind of what usually occurs in biographies. I started dramatizing the story without interviewing anyone first. So it was I was kind of like a third generation on, and I was relating the story from what I remembered. And the story started taking this kind of weird route where the first version of the comic, where everything was kind of heavily fictionalized to the point, or dramatized to the point where it didn't feel real at all to me. My grandparents started becoming people that I never knew. It was kind of a fantasy model of them, and that's where I realized I needed to kind of find, kind of some kind of truth in there, some kind of evidence. and witnesses to these accounts. And I went to my hometown in Western, my ancestral town in Western Greece, and interviewed uncles that were around at the time in the interwar, or around the time, and their accounts were vastly different from what I imagined them to be, or what I remembered my granddad telling me when I was like 10 or 12. And they were very, very more violent. My granddad would gloss over the violent parts. And, my uncles at the time knew that I was at an age, I was like 30 or something, that I could take the violent part of it now. And, I just realized that witnesses and first-person accounts or actual quotes are the stuff from which biographies are made of. And in the case of the Smiths, when the next project was the Tales of the Smiths, and what I did was I gathered, and this is kind of the what I did afterwards with Kirby and Bowie. I gathered for years first a series of quotes, and then I placed them in chronological order in hard copy format. And so I was gathering these old magazines like Melody Maker and Enemy, any quote I could find. So what I wanted tidbits from Morrissey bashing reggae or something, or being a full-on racist or something. Those things mattered, and they did fit in later on in the story. But what I just wanted single short sentences of Morrissey telling me about his Irish ancestry, his early life in Manchester, the band he was into, and the same for Johnny Marr, and then those other quotes too, where he was being a bit fishy with racism and stuff. And every time I'd find a quote, I was like, oh yes, another quote. Even if it was just something like, Manchester in the 70s was a dry and a dead place for people that were created, something like that. I'd go, okay, that's great. It said 70s there. I could fit that in the 70s somewhere in my narrative when he's on a down. And he's also quoted a lot about talking about the punk scene, for instance. And I was always wondering why these biographers, would kind of this information would fly over their heads, because it's kind of a really famous tale that there was 10 or 15 people or something at the first Sex Pistols gig in Manchester in '76, and Morrissey was one of them, and all of them formed famous bands and stuff. But it's just, that's kind of like a half paragraph in every biography, maybe a page, in a biography, and that to me was the meat of the story. And I tried to revolve. I really thought about this, and I was like, okay, Morrissey at the time is not 18 or 19. He sees this band that kind of explodes and changes the cultural scene and music scene in England. And he's been waiting for this for ages because he's a New York Dolls, massive New York Dolls fan. And this thing explodes. And I'm gonna dedicate half a page on this. It's just ridiculous. And anytime I listen to the Smiths, because this is the good thing about getting into bands at a later age, and not, when you're like in your teen years. I got into the Smiths when I was in my 20s, not in my teen years. I'd hear the punk scene. I'd hear post-punk guitar riffs, and I'd hear funk and funk riffs too. And I was like, why aren't people, focusing on this part of the, of their influences? And they're just always talking about Oscar Wilde, or kind of the facade that Morrissey was providing them in the 80s, And so to make a really long story short, there's about, from the 450 pages from the Smiths book, about 80 of them are dedicated to the emergence of the punk scene in Britain, and the Sex Pistols' importance to the formation of the Smiths,
which is matters. I one of my favorite films is 24-Hour Party People. Have you seen that?
Right, yeah, of course, yeah.
And they have the sequence of the Sex Pistols gig, And there's that bit where Steve Coogan's identifying all the people at the gig. There's only supposed to be there's a joke. There's something like less people than there at the Last Supper were at the gig, and then all of these people who were at the gig became famous musicians because they all took something from it. This energy from the Sex Pistols, and then they went off and made wildly different music. Because you have Morrissey and you have Joy Division eventually, and New Order eventually emerge from that. But you also have Mick Hucknall there. Simply Red were also there. So,
it was kind of like the sore thumb out. It's like, we have to admit that he was there.
But I mean,
but he explained his hair.
No, absolutely. And I think as well, what you zeroed in on there is this idea of the Smiths as a press release described band versus the Smiths as a group of lived-in people of individuals who have their own tastes and their own interests and their own that they brought to that music. So it's two very different things, and you're focusing on, again, this. I'm going to keep repeating myself. This idea of lived history versus presented history, if you like,
and also kind of this sense from the press. I mean, the press are kind of guilty on this too. The music press, and I mean the general cultural press, let's say, the general media are incredibly guilty of this because they usually present the Smiths specifically and Bowie specifically as the kind of virgin births in a stale cultural age in which these geniuses splurted out of nowhere and started creating indie guitar music in the mid '80s as if it came out of nowhere, as if Johnny Marr wasn't heavily influenced by Chic, which was embarrassing to admit. I suppose to a lot of music press at the time, and also that the Pistols, who were kind of I suppose passé in the mid '80s, to the regular music press, to admit that they were kind of an influence to these bands, and the same with Bowie. The music press usually showcases this genius that created this kind of outworldly persona in the form of Ziggy Stardust and kind of created the glam scene and all that. But they totally forget, or skim over those 10 or 12 singles and flops that he had in the 60s. And he was, and all that kind of mod phase that he went through and the hippie phase that he went through and all the other phases that he went through until he reached that point. And that's kind of the interesting part of that of Bobby's persona. It's not it's not the moment where Ziggy popped out into the pop scene. It's what led to it,
Yeah.
Coming up, a famous musician of the 80s who once worked for Marvel UK, how Khan dealt with pushback against the political commentary in his comics, and more. Thanks to our supporters on Patreon, another set of classic early episodes of Deconstructing Comics has been unlocked, and I'm putting them back on the site in reverse order. This week I'll republish number 31 from July 10th, 2006, in which Brandon and I discuss the anthology comic The Residents Freak Show, comics based on songs by the band The Residents. Find the classic Deconstructing Comics episodes on our Facebook and Twitter feeds by choosing the earliest months listed in the sidebar pull-down menu at deconstructingcomics.com, in publicly available posts on our Patreon page, or in the Patreon smartphone app. But no more classic episodes have been unlocked, so I won't be re-releasing any more classic episodes until we reach our next Patreon goal. Check out all our goals and help us reach them at patreon.com/deconcomics.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarter Bin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin Podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
I also just quickly wanted to mention, well, while you were talking before about the lives these people lived beforehand, and musicians, what popped into my head was Neil Tennant from the Pet Shop Boys, because and again, this is not something that gets discussed a lot, but for a comic creator, I would love for somebody to do some research into this and maybe tell this story. Tennant was a comics editor for the Marvel UK line in the 1980s. So,
that's right, yeah.
all these comic creators who are from the British scene that we now regard as like amazing creators that Des Skin and Marvel UK published, like Marvel, Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman and a few other folks who came through those halls.
Right.
Neil Tennant was involved in that, and I'm fascinated to learn more about that. Like, what happened there?
Yeah.
And he goes off and becomes Pet Shop Boys.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of if you look into it, there's a lot of other comic book connections to all these styles, especially with Bowie too. And I mean, looking into, I'm also a massive Kiss fan, and Kiss are heavily influenced by comics too. I mean, there's always a connection with, and they were heavily involved actually with the creation of the first kind of gimmicky, what you'd call a 90s gimmick comic in the 70s, when they poured blood into a Marvel Kiss special.
Because Stan Lee knew a good publicity opportunity if he saw one.
Yeah, definitely. And Mark Bolan interviewed, out of all the people because the enemy, I think it was the enemy, gave him the chance to interview someone in the world. They gave him kind of a spot in the enemy to interview people, and of all the people he wanted to interview, one of them was Stan Lee. And this was in Bolan's heyday. So why he'd choose to do Stan Lee is probably because comics influenced his glam kind of persona. And it's interesting. Again, it's one of those things that the music press kind of omits a lot. In the 1970s, this is kind of a poignant moment in Bowie's career. I haven't reached that point in the comic itself, but I will, I suppose, in the next couple of years. Bowie tried to launch a glam band in the form of the Hype, and so he had characters. He got Tony Visconti, who was later his producer for a series of years, for all decades. He was his bass player in the band, and Mick Ronson, who was his regular guitarist and co-songwriter in the guitar years. And they formed a comic book type band, a kind of a proto Kiss in 1970 called The Hype. And they performed with capes and tights and stuff.
Yeah.
And but this was booed. They were booed off. So this was before that long-haired phase where Bowie was booed off the stage from hippies because he was dressed in a dress and stuff. But this people just skim. They just go, okay, that's not interesting enough. I really like the part where Bowie's just in a dress, and he's got long hair and booed off by homophobes in a hippie concert. But the part where it's just like a superhero, that pops totally out of a comic book, is not as interesting as that part. But they were equally booed off the stage in 1970, because in 1970, for some weird reason, and I'll try to get into that and research that when I get to that point. People were interested in the connection between comics and music, or these or dressing up and performing, I suppose. Whereas 2 years later, it became the norm, or 3 years later.
Yeah.
I suppose it has a lot to do with the audience growing into or getting acquainted culturally with the idea of superhero and the Superman. But yeah, it's another topic altogether. But yeah, I mean, a lot of what people find interesting in the stories that I relate is that a lot of the times they go, oh God, why haven't I heard of this before? It's like, you've heard of it before, but the media won't project it because they don't find it interesting enough.
Well, I mean, just in terms of, and I'm not just talking your research, but in terms of how you approach a comics page. You tend to use montage and single moments in time, and then you will have a chunk of text. So it's very text heavy in terms of a comic, and that's where your citations come in, and that's where your quotes come in that you've mentioned. So I find that quite interesting because it's very different from the idea that the comic is an image-based form of media, and people will do a lot of storytelling through the image. Whereas you use quite static images or the blend of montage. And I was interested in your choice, why you specifically chose that, because I looked at your portfolio, and you had an example of a Judge Dredd comic you've done, which I was happy to see was quite politically minded as well. You've got this Reds Under the Beds type story, which Judge Dredd, and it was very dynamic, and it was very action beat, and I see you've made this transition to, no, I am reporting on this character, this lived person. I'm reporting on this using comics as a medium to do that. Is that kind of why you've chosen that?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely consciously called all the books graphic biographies rather than comic book biographies. Although I do call the end book a graphic novel, it doesn't say a comic book novel. It's so it's within the terms themselves, which again are can be misinterpreted. The term of the graphic novel or the graphic biography, and the general audience can have this misconception of what the delivery must be. It's within that misconception that I work. And comics are an image text relation in which a sequence is being narrated, and full stop. It doesn't have to be a decompressed. It can be a decompressed a single second moment over 100 pages, or that single second can be told in a panel. And it's within the multitude of options that you have that the graphic biographies work. I believe that I don't want to blame any or point the finger at any of the other graphic biographies, the graphic novel biographies of any of these people, but it's within this. I believe that it's within only this single format that you have longer quotes in which the subject themselves are narrating the story, that the truth will shine. Otherwise, if I decompress it to the point where all the quotes are elongated in a graphic format rather than a textual format, what will happen was my dramatization would take over from the quote itself and from the middle ground. So what I'm trying to find is this middle ground, which is, okay, I'm dramatizing the moment in the pictorial part of it, but but the readers can also find the truth within the quote from the subject itself. And if I was offering just image, I think that it might have been a bit misconstrued, and that's where a lot of readers find, some biographies over the top or not being, totally in sync with what the artist was about. And again, I don't offer quotes. This is another thing I didn't mention about my methodology. I don't offer quotes right off the bat. I don't just get a quote and go, okay, this is perfect, I'm just going to fit it in there. What I have to do is because I've been collecting quotes for years and years and years. For instance, I'll give you an example. There's a moment where Bowie's eye gets poked out by his friend George Underwood. And this is kind of a really poignant moment in Bowie's biography, because of the eye thing helped a lot in sealing that alien Ziggy performer persona thing. But also, a lot of people know this moment. And so when researching this part of Bowie's life, I had 2 or 3 quotes at hand because you can find these things online all over the place usually with no sources. So I had to find the actual sources where they were quoted from, from 70s music press and stuff. And once I did that, I started following up on what Bowie talked about, how Bowie described or narrated this story again in the 80s and the 90s and the zeros. And the story will change all the time. Once it was about him getting in a fight with George Underwood about, a girl. Another time he was pissed off about something about him being in the band and not letting him play saxophone in the band. Another time it was a fingernail, George's fingernail poking his eye out. Another time it was the punch itself. So this story would change all the time as the years passed by, because the memory that the people, the first-hand memory of the people that actually lived the event would, and the perception of these events would change as time went by. And so my task is not only to find a middle ground and deliver what I perceive as the first-hand account and the truth, but to also merge these truths into another middle ground. So I've got the middle ground, which is the quote itself, but I've also got another one, which is editing and choosing which one of these truths is the most valid one. And it's usually the one that's the earliest story told, to be fair.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that feeling that you're treating it like research. You're going for the closest to a primary source that you can find. That's how I tend to read your work. There's a sense of this is as close to a fact as I can determine it is.
Yeah, and there's no way I could go back and revisit Bowie himself, or I don't even know if he was alive if he could allow me to do this anyway. So my plan was to do it through quotes in any case. And to be fair, if I picked up another subject in the future, it's probably the way I'd go, because with most artists that I still listen to, most musicians I still listen to, from a lot of them from the 70s or the 80s, their approach to their own lives, their early lives, from interviews from 70s and 80s, is a much more honest account of what they officially splurted out later on in official autobiographies and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough with the Smiths, actually, that I was 3/4 in. I'd already published online as a webcomic 3/4 of the book when Morrissey's autobiography came out. And strangely enough, a lot of the stuff that I was dramatizing with my own initiative turned up in his book, and it was a great feeling. But at the same time, I thought, oh God, everyone's going to think that I read his book first. Everyone that's going to read the graphography after the event is going to think that I took this stuff from the book. But in any case, that's the dangers of doing this type of research for years.
We've touched on this a couple of times now. You mentioned the Jack Kirby Facebook pages, and you mentioned the Bowie ephemera that's come up recently. But how have you dealt with say fans of the Smiths or Bowie or Kirby reading your work? Because clearly that you could maybe sell it to them because it's something they would be interested in buying, but on the other hand, they would have very fixed ideas of these subjects that you've perhaps punctured a bit with your approach.
Right. Okay. So in the case of this, so there's two kind of timelines here. One is a timeline in which I was paid from the chocolate company to post these comics online. I was getting paid for them, so I didn't care.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, I'm doing this. I know this is, I'm happy with my work. I'm sharing it in all these groups, but I wasn't really really conscious or didn't really care about a lot of the opinion. Now, what happened was afterwards, the funding stopped from this chocolate company last year, actually. And I already had a Patreon set up. So I started posting the rest of my Bowie comics from then on my Patreon. And most of the comics, the weekly web comics because Rebel Rebel is a weekly web comic, which I didn't mention. And it's on my Patreon. Most of the episodes are locked for the patrons, and so after the funding was pulled out, I had to kind of figure a way of making this enticing to the fan base.
You got to promote it, yeah.
You know, I did. Yes, I had to promote it, I suppose, in a way that doesn't seem, very pesty or kind of like, that person promoting stuff on Bowie groups. So I try my best not to make it seem that way. Now, what happens there is, there's two ways of treating this, kind of being in a Zen state in which you're like, okay, whatever happens. I'm going to do this comic anyway. And whoever jumps onto it. And the other thing is to kind of get really pissed off at the reaction. Yeah. But I tend not to anymore. I think I did a bit with the Smiths, at the start. Some of them were like, what is this? It's terrible. It's not Morrissey or whatever. But, I don't mind that much. I mean, sometimes it gets aggravating when you post what I consider. Sometimes I go, okay, this episode's kind of, it's got some really great revelations in it. And it's talking about matters that no one ever knew about, Bowie, for instance.
Yeah.
And, it's posted to these 50 odd groups on Facebook and stuff. And you'd get something like 10 reactions or, 50 reactions all together. And then someone will post, the same guy will post Life on Mars again in this group, and they'd get, 300 reactions on it. And on the next day, he'd post Life on Mars again, because it's the Life on Mars Bowie group or something. And he'd get another 300 reactions. But, it's the way things are. And I have had people go, why are you making money out of this? Or why are you doing this? We're not into this stuff. We're into Bowie's music or whatever. But it's something I think that every biographer has had to kind of put up with. And it's perhaps also, the problematic relationship people have with graphic novels or the comic book format that causes this. If it was a regular biography, a prose biography, I think I think it would have sold well, much better, and B, people would have treated it as something more valid.
So
even though I spent 10 pages on the origin story again.
So by that you mean if it was a biography as in a text biography versus a comic. So because the comic is still seen as a vulgar form of art, if you like.
Definitely. And I mean, all the kind of the marvelization of the visual, media from games to movies to anything visual at the moment, it isn't helping a lot. In my case, every time you mention comics, someone will mention something like the Avengers or something.
Yeah, that's the association.
In the 90s, this was great because you'd be like, oh, wow, the Avengers? Now it's a burden.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought we'd moved past the opportunity to ask you about this, but I'm going to take it now because you've talked about your work in Greece and what looks like a really interesting comic scene in Greece. That number one, I don't speak Greek, so I can't read those comics.
Right. Okay.
And number two, I am kicking myself because years ago I had a friend in the Foreign Service who was posted in Greece, and he had set up a comics convention, or he was involved somehow in a comics convention in Greece.
Oh, really?
And he was basically invited me to come as a representative of Irish comics, which I didn't feel I had any right to do because I still only have so many books to my name. And number two, I was like, I have to go all that way. I didn't. So I regret it immensely because I should have gone. I was very tickled to see your giant size fascist comics. And how you've taken like fascist iconography, this idea of fascism as a present danger, and then you've used Silver Age American comic imagery to introduce this, or to parody this, and I found that fascinating. Just this, particularly since you've, as we've addressed before, you are touching on the political context of people like Kirby, but now you've had situations where shortly after you were doing Giant Size Fascist in America, you had a situation where a comics writer called Ed Brubaker had to apologize to Fox News because an issue of Captain America featured a Tea Party rally. And that was no, can't do that.
So this criticism was coming from the other end.
Yeah. So it was the Tea Party itself was upset that Captain America featured a Tea Party rally, and Fox News became the vehicle by which Marvel got pulled up, and they more or less responded by going, "Oh, we're so sorry. We're sorry we caused offense." As opposed to you're an anti-tax political party that is dressing up like the original Tea Party. Frankly, go and take a jump. Like, what else? But no, they buckled immediately. The fact that you were using or tackling fascism in a left-wing magazine, and my understanding is based on comments you've made that people on the right and people on the left were both upset with you for that.
It became kind of massive in the comic scene itself, which isn't that big, to be fair, but it became massive in the comic scene, and I'd already made a name for myself self-publishing for years, and I was publishing short stories in the magazine called Nine, as in the Ninth Art Form, which was a weekly supplement in the Greece's biggest newspaper. So, I had a name for myself then. But the stories I was telling were, they did have kind of all the stories had kind of a political leaning to them, kind of a liberal political leaning to them. But I was heavily getting into Kirby at the time, and the far right wasn't wasn't as popular, or wasn't reaching the crowd that it reached after the economic crash of 2009 or 2010. It was still a kind of a fringe, the Golden Dawn actually in Greece.
I was going to ask,
a fringe party. Yeah, they were kind of a fringe party, kind of like a gang more than a party. That reached out to something like 0.5% in terms of votes in the population. At some point they reached something like 6 or 7%, or maybe even 8%. I can't remember now. So they were kind of this fringe party that you'd kind of laugh at or fear if you were like in that area of town in which they knifed immigrants. So I lived kind of in an area where there was a lot of uprisings against the police and stuff in central Athens. Against kind of and you'd have a lot of political rallies in that area. So I was getting really into that stuff at the same time. This way before the crisis, and so when I started publishing that, there were kind of two reactions to it. One was from, the comics crowd in general, the liberal comics crowd kind of embraced it. But then there were a lot of people that knew nothing about comics and knew nothing about Kirby at all. And all they saw was a flag-wearing protagonist, treating the flag like a Tea Party type. that treating the flag with disrespect and all that stuff. So I'd get a lot of menacing comments online and stuff at the time, but I'd just brush them off until at some point I had and this is where I kind of stopped public appearances in Greece. At some point, I went to the second biggest city in Greece, Saloniki, and I had they were presenting one of the books there, one of the giant-sized fascist books, and there was a fairly large crowd, and in there, interested in the book, they weren't there to do anything weird, but suddenly these kind of oldies that were kind of followers or acolytes of the military dictatorship of 67 appeared and started throwing stuff at me and shouting chants at stuff outside and protesting. And that's when I thought, okay, this is great. I had fun with with this parody, but now it's starting to get a bit weird. And then suddenly I found myself, after the presentation was over, everyone just went to their own place, to their own homes in this town in which I knew no one. My publisher bailed, and I was in the middle of nowhere, and these, around the corner, there was these kind of really violent types ready to make a mess out of me. So I managed to get out, but the thing is that it reached a point where it was, you can see what a narrative can, kind of the fear and negativity that a print, ink on a page can bring out in people, but also it kind of makes me ruminate again about why am I doing this? Is this something I want to do? It's because I could have. There was an option there to continue doing this, to continue pissing these people off, and to kind of bring joy to the opposite side. But I was. So then you can start playing a weird part and being a pawn in a game in which you never chose to be. So I began serializing the sequel to this story in a very, very, very kind of left-leaning political magazine called Galera, and they were kind of the let's say they were kind of a part of what the Syriza government became later. A lot of the people in there. And there was definitely a push to kind of to please this kind of party, and I felt like I don't want to play a game, part of this game anymore. So when I started seeing kind of what's going on the other side, because they were being a bit fishy with a lot of stuff too, and I started mentioning, I started parodying hardcore, I suppose, communists a lot in the comic itself. I weirdly or not strangely enough started getting a lot of hate from that side too.
Yeah.
And in any case, I stopped watching that. Then I moved to the UK. I was doing the Biography stuff, and years later, Syriza was everyone was predicting that they were about to be the new. Syriza was a left, kind of hardcore left party at the time. That they were about to be voted into government. And in 2015, the major paper that was backing them reached out to me and they said, "Hey, we've got this running feature where we've got cartoonists doing a lot of stuff on the political scene in Greece. Do you want to do a comic?" I said, "Sure." And they said, "Okay, what are you thinking of doing?" I go, "Well, I was thinking of continuing John's Like Fascist at some point, and I think it's kind of the right time to do it." Because everything was getting really weird with Golden Dawn and the leftists and the right wingers in Greece. I said, I was kind of over that phase again. I was looking at it with a fresh kind of point of view. I thought I could reach out, I could kind of work on it, having all this stuff in mind again. And I'm not that kind of, I'm a bit older now, a bit more mature. I can reach, I'll see how I can approach a Kirby comic at a later age, kind of like my Eternals phase or something. And I did it, and they said, "There's no way we're going to publish this. We'll pay you for it, and we're not publishing it." After I'd submitted the story to them.
Why?
And surely it was about it was a parody of what how the police would continue operating and oppressing people in that specific area in which the uprisings occurred after Syriza would come to power. So it was a kind of a prediction of this in the sense that, no government, left or right, will stop police oppression because it's against their interests. And it was disguised in the form of the giant-sized fascist superheroes. And they said, "No, we're paying you for this, but we're not putting it in there." I said, "I can't get your money to be censored from you." And so we had this kind of fallout. And that's when I stopped. I said, "Okay, I can't do this. I can't operate in this country by doing political leaning or political comics without being censored." And this occurred from all sides left and right, in Greek newspapers and Greek magazines. I didn't mention the right-wing magazines that I participated in the noughties, because they too also censored me, but that's kind of a given.
Yeah. So, do you have the rights to that material? I'm just wondering, since they paid you,
yeah,
you have the rights to that, so you could potentially republish that yourself if you chose to.
Yeah, I mean, from the 90s on until, because I did some stuff in Australia too when I was younger, until kind of today. I've only worked as a writer something like 2 times on really short stories. Most of the work is creator owned. Republishing that stuff, the giant-sized fascist stuff in English, would need, I'd publish something like 100 pages or 200 pages, let's say, of a graphic novel on giant-sized fascists, a republication. But then you'd need a 300-page appendix on the Greek military junta and the 1821 Independence War, and all these weird kind of stuff that's referenced in there. Yeah. So you'd have to have a kind of in-depth knowledge on the puns, because the puns are what drive the story. It's silly puns most of the time, but it's puns on sayings that kind of a Tea Party type revolutionary hero would say in 1821 that everyone knows in Greece, but no one outside the country knows.
There's the Alan Moore League of Extraordinary Gentlemen annotations that Jess Nevins comes out with every time there's new Alan Moore work. Jess Nevins has done all the reading, and he's, you'll read the story that Moore has written and you'll go, "Oh, that's an interesting story," but it turns out there's so much more, because Moore has written, or has read all of these books and all this sort of, early Gothic fiction that is no longer in print. You can't find it, but Jess Nevins has read it. Right. So what I'm imagining almost is you republishing Giant-Sized Fascists as a webcomic, and then these annotations by your own Jess Nevins, who's done all the hard labor for you, and he's going to type it all out and say,
perhaps
this is what you need to understand.
Yeah. I mean, it's been featured in Giant-Sized Fascists has been featured, and there's a commentary in PhDs in Greece. And there was a massive tome called The Greek Comics, in which it's featured heavily. But so there is some commentary there, on a more serious note and a more kind of objective note. It's the topic is real. It's like me trying to get into the equivalent of kind of a Bulgarian, for instance, giant-sized fascists, and not knowing anything about their kind of 18th century or 9th century history and stuff.
I just find that the timing of us having this conversation and your work on Kirby, as well as your work on Giant-Sized Fascist, is quite interesting, given that this week you have, I think is it Kirby's grandson, basically arguing against the appropriation of Captain America by the fascist right in the States, and this attempted insurrection.
Oh, right. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so there's been this statement from the Kirby family, from the current representative of the Kirby family. I believe it's the grandson. I could be wrong on that. Because there were insurrectionists, if we're calling them that, wearing Captain America imagery. And there already has been a number of American fascists who like to use the Punisher emblem as well. So they're leaning in on these American comic imagery to justify their sort of fascist views. And part of that is this idea of the superhero solves the problem by punching the problem.
Right.
I think that's what lies at the heart of it, is this idea, this sort of quasi-fascist instinct within superhero fiction that you can change a political reality by just punching the enemy, whoever the enemy may happen to be.
Yeah.
And that's the danger, and that's what I think Kirby was extremely conscious of. Hence his sort of ideas, particularly in the New Gods and things like that, where you could see the cleverness and wit and negotiation are equally important as much as punching things. But yeah,
right, definitely. I mean, it is a shame, to be fair. Now, working on the Kirby comic, it's a shame that a lot of people say this, not just me, that Kirby didn't work on more kind of introspective pieces in which his thoughts on matters like this unravel in a more kind of in a less sensationalist way. And that's kind of the trouble with reading Kirby with a lot of people. They don't understand his this other side to him. And he did this autobiographical story which was Streetwise. I don't know if you've read it, which talks about his really younger years. It's the only kind of story with which he talks about his own life and in which he's drawn. So this was commissioned kind of in the early 80s, and he talks about his, it's a single moment in which he talks about street fights and New York in the 20s and 30s. And it's a kind of a 6 or 7 page story that was released in an anthology in the States. And the general consensus is that the reason why he didn't delve into these matters in depth is because he couldn't get paid for them at the time. And unfortunately, Kirby's career was over by the time Will Eisner was going into that kind of more mature phase of his, where he started working on the graphic novel, let's say, if we can call it that, because everyone's kind of still...
He took the credit for calling it that. Will Eisner was like, I invented the graphic novel.
Yeah, everyone's kind of still pissed off with him about it in the comic scene. But in any case, it's another topic altogether. But but so when Eisner was doing the contract book, Kirby was kind of on a down phase, and his drawings started getting a bit messier. And in any case, he couldn't jump on that that phase in which comics were starting to mature and people were starting to talk about matters that were closer to their heart rather than trying to fit it into an action format. And just like you, I can see all these messages in New Gods and all these other comics, but and in his interviews he does talk briefly touch upon about his kind of political thought and stuff, but we've never really had an in-depth kind of presentation of these thoughts, and we haven't had the kind of in-depth, especially graphic presentation of these thoughts. But you can, if you pick and choose, and if you're kind of good at doing that, you can find these moments in anything from even in things like The Losers, his war comic, or even Sergeant Fury and stuff, which relates a lot to his own war experience against the Nazis.
Sir, I am conscious that we have been talking for quite some time, and while I had a couple of other questions, I think we might end it shortly. I mean, I do want to quickly mention your work with Upside Comics, and that sounds really interesting. And this idea of comics as an educational tool, I grew up at a time when reading comics was still seen as something that would rot your brain. So I'm glad you are
right.
This idea of comics as literacy support. I think that's very wonderful to see.
Well, my full-time job at the moment for the past 3 years is as a lecturer at Teesside University on the comics course. So, and that's it's great to see students approaching comics as an academic option and as a professional option too. It's not just something to be embarrassed about in a kind of damp basement.
Yeah, I'm fascinated.
I never lived in a damp basement, but
yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of comics being embraced by academia, but it just so happens is at the time when academia is becoming more precarious. I'm like, God damn it! So
right. Yeah.
So it's an interesting time. But for the folks listening, where would you like people to find you? Where should people? You mentioned your Patreon as well for your online comics.
Right. So I have a Patreon, which is patreon.com and then /Chrisoulis. And in there you can read the weekly, the new weekly episodes of Rebel. So I'm currently at episode 280. So they're locked at the moment for people that are subscribing to the Patreon. But you can read all the episodes, all the previous episodes and the current one starting from $1 US a month, which is pretty fair, I think. Now, if you want to, there's some goals there. So, for instance, if you pay $7 a month, I get to send you something every 3 months, like a personal reward. And it's usually in the form of a printed artifact. So it might be a printed copy of the book itself. So I've released 3 printed chapters collecting the first 100 episodes. I self-published those and sent them out to the patrons. And also, things like toasters, tote bags, anything like that. But it's usually in the form of printed books. And also, the supporters can also commission work from me too. So I've had a lot of people commission, Bowie portraits and things like that. After 3 months of being subscribed on the upper tier rewards. And then also you can read these chapters again if you want to digitally, not in print, on Comixology. So if you go to comixology.com, you can download them to your tablet and read them in that format. Now I've only published the first 3 chapters, which is 100 episodes, and I'm about 300 episodes in, so I'm doing this kind of slowly. But eventually, I'm hoping to get the whole thing published, at least the first phase, the first volume from 1947, his birth, until 1969. That's going to be a first kind of volume. Otherwise, it's going to get too big for its own good. I don't want the book splitting in people's hands. So I'm hoping to reach about 500 pages, just like with the Smith's book, to get that published. Now, the Smith's book itself is also available in print since 2018 from Omnibus Press. That's been released worldwide. You can find that in any bookstore, from Amazon to Barnes and Noble to anything. Or you can get the ISBN of the book and go to your local bookstore or comic book store and order it from them. It's probably best to do that to support that kind of to support these bookstores and local comic book stores too.
Yeah. And
you can also find that in Comixology as well. And the Kirby book is available on Comixology at the moment.
Mm.
And that's the first chapter again. So I'm still working on the Kirby book. And
as I mentioned before, I strongly recommend folks check out the Kirby book too. Like, I loved that's why I wrote about you in the first instance. I really liked what you did with Bowie, but the Kirby book too. I love the approach, and I love this idea of establishing Kirby's political reality, if you like. Before Kirby himself exists. There's this sense of all these things are in motion, and now we've got Jack Kirby. So I really appreciate that. Sir, thank you for that, and thank you for that comprehensive guide as to where we can find your work.
Yeah. But it was a great conversation.
Lovely talking to you, man. Cheers.
Great.
I'll link to Khan's Patreon page in the show notes. Want to support this podcast? You can help us out by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/DconComics. and go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. Don't forget our Fullmetal Alchemist podcast, The Law of Equivalent Exchange, is now in its own feed and available in the usual podcast outlets. Our review of Chapter 8 is coming out on Monday. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Next week, Kumar and Emmet discuss Crowded, written by Christopher Sebela, with art from Ro Stein, Ted Brandt, Trina Farrell, and Cardinal Ray. Till next time, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.